most cities, it's not really in their political interest, or certainly not their financial interest, to really tackle homelessness, right? So let's say you're a small city in the San Gabriel Valley, or whatever, the city of San Fernando here in the San Fernando Valley. What incentive do you have to really put a lot of resources behind affordable housing, particularly for the homeless, right? Because your constituency are typically your homeowners, and they are not interested in having homeless services close to them for reasons that I think most people know. And if you do construct them, then more people will come. And so then you need more. And so the answer that most cities, not just in California or LA or the Valley, have done is just move the problem down the road.
Welcome to Diving into Discourse. My name is Javier Rojas, and today I'm joined by seasoned political science professor Tom Hoganish, and we're exploring the topic of homelessness in Los Angeles. So, Tom, there's a lot here we can start with, but let's give some background for listeners about what happened this past June with the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so the ruling overruled the 2018 decision that the Fifth Circuit, a Court of Appeals, had made back in 2018 in another western city, Boise, Idaho. And it basically said that if a city is giving fines or imprisonment or any kind of sanction to homeless people, they have to offer them some shelter. And if they don't, then it's cruel and unusual to fine them or put them in jail. And recently, the recent Supreme Court decision basically said this is not a cruel and unusual Eighth Amendment decision. And so cities are now absolved of any formal responsibility to provide, housing for somebody who's homeless.
Interesting. Can you provide a little background about what homelessness has been historically in California? I think that the issue has become more visible in people's eyes in maybe the last 10 years, but I feel that there's some background missing about how this became such a big issue with rising housing costs as well.
So in my housing policy class, it takes at least 3/4 of the semester to answer that question. So UCLA did a study, I think it was in 2021, and it basically told the story of the history of homelessness in Los Angeles. And it goes back to the late 19th century, as you had a lot of people moving to LA. And so homelessness has always been part of the discussion in Los Angeles. You look at the 1930s and the Great Depression, that created a lot of homeless issues for Los Angelinos. But Los Angeles and California have kind of followed a model of housing that I think has finally caught up to us, and that is the single family home, right? Surrounded by a yard and then connected to other places by the automobile and then eventually a freeway system, right? So this was kind of the model for California. So California today has about 75% of our housing is single family homes. Los Angeles in 1930 was 95% single family homes, right? So this was kind of the model. And believe it or not, housing in Los Angeles, even here in the San Fernando Valley, was relatively cheap until the middle 1970s. And that's when you saw this big migration to Los Angeles from other parts of the United States, as well as perhaps other parts of the world. And that began to really put pressure on the existing housing stock. So the reaction of homeowners at that time to, the need for more housing was to put up a big fight. And so the most well-organized communities have basically become like homeowners associations. So I'll give you one example, or a couple examples locally. So the city of San Marino is in the San Gabriel Valley. It's just south of Pasadena. All of the housing stock is zoned R1, single family homes. So you cannot build an apartment there. You can't even build a townhouse in San Marino. And there are a number of cities like that. There's a city in the Bay Area called Woodside, California, which has huge lots. I mean, like several acres, and many cities use kind of a minimum lot size to keep the the property values up and make it difficult to build any new housing. But Woodside came up with a great idea last year, which was to declare itself a cougar sanctuary. And so cities, right, depending on their political acumen and the preferences of their communities, have just simply tried to push affordable housing onto the next town. And that's an effective strategy, right? Because politically, that's what people want. Or most communities are not really seeking out density. There are some exceptions, right? I would say the community that I know best, I lived in Pasadena for many years, sought kind of a density strategy around public transit. The Gold Line has about 4 or 5 stops in Pasadena, and then kind of densifying the areas around the transit. But none of this was particularly affordable.
Of course.
And that gets down to, I think, the nitty gritty of the situation is that building anything affordable is really, really difficult.
I would assume this has some sort of effect on people, lack of finding housing in some effect.
Yeah, I mean, so if you talk to economists, right, they'll tell you this is a supply and demand issue. And so I like to think of housing as something that you can look at from 30,000 feet, and it's a supply and demand issue. And then you can also look at housing policy right at the micro level.
Would be like rent control.
And so rent control is helpful for people who already have housing. But, if you're trying to incentivize the construction of housing and then at the same time telling, well, if you build more housing, we're going to make sure that you can't raise the rent on people. Then so a lot of times the housing policy is going in different directions, and it's at this kind of either 30,000 foot level or the micro level. And so cities have been trying a whole range of strategies at the micro level, some of which I think are super helpful. Project Room Key, I think probably a lot of people know. During the pandemic, you had all these hotels that are sitting empty. Hotels are kind of like housing.
From what I understand, these are very creative but temporary solutions. Getting people into a permanent housing seems like always the big roadblock at the end. And who pays for that? And I think those are some of the questions that I think of many people raise as well.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, let me jump in on that point of cost. So a family friend of ours works for one of these nonprofit housing agencies, and I was teaching this housing policy class last spring, and I happened to see her at one of my son's soccer games, and so we started chatting about housing policy, and I said, my understanding is that it costs about $500,000 per unit to construct housing in LA County, and she said, that's absolutely not correct. It's 650,000. I mean, when you take that in, you realize that's really ultimately why it's so difficult. Even if there was like a magic pot of money out there, how many units could you really build at that level? And so I think somebody or some way, technology, some whatever billionaire or somebody's going to have to come up with some way to bring those costs down, whether it's 3D printers. This is beyond my pay grade, but something that is much more affordable, because that's just never going to pencil out. So California needs roughly 200,000 units every year, and has so probably since the 80s. And for the last, say, 10 years or so, we've constructed about half that.
We've discussed this, but what role do local cities play in solving homelessness? It's a very broad question, but which role do they play?
Well, I think it depends on their political preferences. Most cities, it's not really in their political interest, or certainly not their financial interest, to really tackle homelessness, right? So let's say you're a small city in the San Gabriel Valley, or whatever, the city of San Fernando here in the San Fernando Valley. What incentive do you have to really put a lot of resources behind affordable housing, particularly for the homeless, right? Because your constituency are typically your homeowners, and they are not interested in having homeless services close to them for reasons that I think most people know. And if you do construct them, then more people will come. And so then you need more. And so the answer that most cities, not just in California or LA or the Valley, have done is just move the problem down the road, right? The so called Greyhound therapy, as it's called. When hospitals release people for mental health holds, they'll typically release them in places like Santa Clarita, for example. And then Santa Clarita will bus them to downtown Los Angeles.
It's a whole cycle, sounds like.
Yeah, and what they say is that that's where the services are. So what are they going to do in Santa Clarita? So Santa Clarita is not sitting around saying, oh my gosh, we have to provide all these services, because they know what will happen.
And I would assume if a small, medium-sized city had this issue on the front lawn, whatever, they would have only small shelter space to accompany to actually help them.
Yeah, and that comes up in that Boise decision, right? The idea of you can't criminalize homelessness unless you have shelters. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, that this wasn't a cruel and unusual punishment case, an Eighth Amendment case. But, if it had become a national law, then cities around the United States would then be responsible for maintaining homeless, affordable housing, all the time. And even though many of us might say, well, that's a great idea. Wouldn't that be great if that happened? I mean, first of all, cities would then have to find that housing, right? Or construct that housing.
Where would they get the money for that?
Where do they get the money for that?
Yeah.
Second, you have to staff. And this is one of the elements of the problem that I think is kind of easily sort of lost. We think about, housing is just a unit with a bathroom and a kitchen sink or whatever. Most homeless people are facing some kind of mental health issue or substance abuse issue. And so you have to provide them these kind of wraparound services, mental health counseling, for example, medication. And so the people who provide the services need to be extremely experienced and trained. And so just staffing up and then having that staff on hand, when the problem is beginning to crest in your city, it's not really realistic for local governments, right? So counties and cities to have that. Now, this is where the nonprofit organizations can kind of fill in the gap and often do, but even then, there's just not nearly enough people trained in this, and then you get back to the money, the cost.
Yeah. And from my understanding, there's a lot of burnout from people working in those specific jobs.
Correct.
Yeah. And they don't pay the greatest, from my understanding as well.
That's another. Those are both good reasons why it's hard to maintain that staffing, because it's a really difficult job, not paid anywhere near the level that that people probably deserve or would make it worthwhile to stay in that line of work.
And I've seen LA try its best to provide those wraparound services, and there's been some success, from my understanding, but it's hard to do that for the population that actually needs this help. There's a lot more more people on the streets than there is actual service workers.
Oh, it's not even close. I mean, I think I could be a little bit off, but I think in LA County you're looking at 65 or 70,000 people on a nightly basis, and then in downtown Los Angeles, I think it's like 20 or 25. And people are concentrated in these areas, and that's been kind of the policy that the city of LA has sort of pursued for many decades, was to sort of contain homelessness, right?
So it seems like into one area, but
that's right.
Post-pandemic, seems like that's spilled over.
Well, that's what has made this kind of a front and center political issue throughout the United States, right? And so once you saw homeless people showing up in the neighborhoods, here in Northridge or Chatsworth, people were really shocked because, I guess you could say out of sight, out of mind for most people. Like, they'll pass an initiative or, proposition once every 5 or 10 years, but they don't want to see the reality of the situation in their neighborhood, right? To give them a sense of disorder and chaos. And so it's become a huge political issue, and, it's wrapped in our presidential politics.
Yeah.
And Governor Newsom has gotten caught up in this.
Let's get into that. Recently, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, he was very outspoken, and he said that cities and counties aren't doing enough, pretty much. And he was threatening to withhold funding for them if there was any, recognizable action being taken. He pointed specifically to the LA County Board of Supervisors, one of the people that, one of the entities that hasn't been taking enough action.
Yeah, I mean, Newsom is an interesting case study, right? So he himself was a mayor in San Francisco, and of course, every city, has had homeless issues, but he knows like how difficult homelessness is to solve, and he's made housing probably his number one kind of priority. I forget how many housing bills he's signed in his time as governor, but it's like, I don't know, like 40 or something.
Definitely at the forefront, yeah.
And so, but at the same time, as a governor, trying to solve homeless is much more difficult than passing, for example, Senate Bill 9, which did away with single-family zoning. That was a huge deal. I never thought I would live long enough to see California do that. But so then Newsom becomes kind of wrapped up in our presidential politics, right? As California becomes kind of this boogeyman, as it's long been. As long as I've lived in California since the '80s, California has always been kind of the boogeyman for the right in this country. And so, if you watch, some of the media on the right, you see California is presented as just being completely out of control. Yeah. And then during the pandemic and afterwards, it literally was out of control. Yeah. Particularly in San Francisco. And so even the mayor of San Francisco now, seems to agree with the governor that the status quo can't continue. But the problem is, where do people
set of housing?
So I like to think of housing as kind of the big issue, and then homelessness is kind of a subset of housing policy. But it's a really big and really important subset because it's the one that we see. Yeah. Right, and that's the one I think that people respond to kind of emotionally. You see people on the street, and nobody likes, obviously, to see their fellow residents and of Los Angeles being homeless. And of course, lots of just regular average people have been pushed into homelessness.
Yeah, I think to touch on that point. I think, and this is from what I understand, is maybe in the 80s, 90s, you would see homeless here in Los Angeles, but it would be for different reasons. Maybe it was drug use, but today you see young families out in the streets, maybe because of higher rents, different reasons like that.
Yep. Students.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's not forget students.
Exactly. People living in cars. Yep. I see many stories of college students living in their cars. Yeah. Seems like a lot of it has to do, like you said, with rents, reasons like that. Yeah. It's just interesting to see how that.
And that's another supply and demand issue, right? The cost of housing, has skyrocketed. The cost of rent has skyrocketed. There's also this interesting mismatch, right? So if you look at neighborhoods in the San Fernando, more kind of the more affluent neighborhoods, Studio City, Sherman Oaks, Encino, Woodland, just take that corridor, for example, and you look at the ratio of people living in the house to the square footage of the house or the number of bedrooms. I mean, you have like an average of like 2.5 people living in a lot of these houses, and then there's like 4 or 5 bedrooms. Yeah. And then you cross the freeway and you get into, Reseda or Canoga Park. Yeah. And then, the whole thing just flips. You have like 1-bedroom apartment or maybe a 2-bedroom or even a studio apartment, and you've got like 7 or 8 people living. Or even living in the garage, right? That's another very popular sort of housing strategy that people all over Southern California you have. And so cities have to like decide, are we going to enforce, are we going to allow people to live in a garage, with no plumbing? But are we going to allow people? LA is sort of caught, right, in between, people, perhaps the neighborhood would like, more enforcement. If you live in San Marino, you wouldn't get away with that for 48 hours. Yeah. I mean, the cops would be, totally on that situation. But LA, has to respond. So these bigger cities can't really turn their back on homelessness in the way that a La Cañada can just sort of push people down the road.
I know we talk about possible solutions, but is the straightforward answer, do you think, is it just building our way out of this?
Yeah. I was reading one of these studies, just kind of refreshing my memory before I came over, and the author of the study said there are three main solutions to the affordable housing crisis in California. One is build more housing.
Yeah.
Two, build more housing, and three, build more housing. I mean, obviously that's a little bit tongue in cheek, but at the end of the day, that's kind of the 30,000 foot solution.
Yeah.
And it's difficult because we have given local jurisdictions, right, the ability to mainly govern land use, not just in California, but all over the country. Well, I just want to highlight something earlier I think I meant to say, and I didn't.
Yeah.
And that this affordable housing situation is now all over, not just the United States, but all over Western Europe, and I believe, some of the more industrialized places in East Asia as well. And so I feel like we're just at a time in history, similar to after World War II. So after World War II, GIs return home, there's this baby boom, and there's just not enough housing. And, at that time, that's when the automobile is taking over, and that's when the national government is now subsidizing mortgages. And so making it cheaper for suburbanization. And guess what? We've got all this land. I mean, if you've ever flown over the United States, this one thing we do have is plenty of space to build. Another point I would add is that there's lots of affordable housing in the United States. It just isn't in the major cities.
That's one of the big talking points I hear. Why California and why Los Angeles? But obviously the weather, I'm assuming, is one of the biggest, points as to being here. But
yeah. Look, LA is a great place to live. I tell my students this all the time. LA is a great place to live. There's lots of great places to live in the United States where the houses are much cheaper. Like a third or a fifth of what you would pay now. Now the wages are also typically lower, but there are affordable housing and there are costs to that as well. So one of the things about Los Angeles is that we're kind of built out. There's no next valley.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the big problem that we're facing. That's not what's being faced in like cities in Texas.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Houston and Dallas and Fort Worth, they just keep going out, and everybody says what a great job Texas is doing on affordable housing. But their geography allows that. We've got the mountains, we've got the ocean, we've got a desert, and so I mean that's one answer to the affordable housing crisis. And I think a lot of families, at least anecdotally, are leaving California, or at least leaving Los Angeles, like Orange County. There was an article in the LA Times, like, we're leaving Orange County, which has a medium housing, I think the median was like $1 million. And then they were going to move to Sacramento, which isn't actually that much cheaper, but there are communities near Sacramento that are more affordable.
But the concept of a super commuter is becoming very normal in Southern California. People doing that cross county trek daily, which sounds terrible, and it is. I'm sure there's bad health effects to do with that. So
that's right.
Oh yeah.
So for those of us in the valley, the Antelope Valley has been the kind of next valley, and for a number of decades has been the place where people would seek affordable housing, and then pay the cost of that commute. And there's data to back that up. There are a whole bunch of costs, not just monetary costs, but mental health costs, more substance abuse among people with that kind of commute, and then also things like domestic abuse are also. So there are significant costs to, but telecommuting.
Yeah.
It's so interesting the way that nobody saw the pandemic coming, and yet the pandemic sort of shifted work in a way that made it more likely that you would be able to work from home. Now that's not for everybody, right? The service workers can't work from home.
I'd like to hear your thoughts. I know one of the next big things that the city's gearing up for is the 2020 Olympics. I think one of the first things people talk about or just think about is what's going to happen with the homeless. What are your thoughts initially on that?
Well, I mean, these are political events,
Yeah.
right? The Olympics, and obviously LA wants to put on a good
Of
face
course.
for the world. But your question kind of reminds me of what happened when the Chinese President Xi visited Joe Biden in San Francisco. And my understanding is that the city of San Francisco literally corralled people into buses and moved them out for a few days.
Yep.
And then I suppose they found their way back. I'm not 100% sure what happened there,
The
but
streets look clean also. Yeah.
so there was this impression that like everything was great in Chinatown or whatever. I had just previously been to San Francisco for a conference prior to that trip, and I had been shocked by the homeless problem in San Francisco in the '90s and how aggressive and how unsafe it felt. And that's pretty much how I felt when I visited there prior to that meeting. But so the Olympics are coming. The Olympics are events that are held in places like stadiums,
Yeah.
and they're on television. I don't think that's something that the cameras are going to see that much.
Because
I don't think the city is going to spend a lot of resources trying to cover this up. That's sort of
We have 4 years to take concrete action, and right now there's a lot of rhetoric from across the city, as we discussed. So,
well, there has been some progress, and remember, it's always tricky to count the homeless, and there's politics involved. There's different methodologies involved, but there has been some. I think a couple of studies recently have suggested that the problem is no longer getting worse.
I saw there was a little drop in it, especially in LA.
Yeah, and when you say a little drop, it was like super small number. It was not even like 1%, I think. So, that's kind of like we've stopped, like the problem is not getting worse. Now leveling off, yeah. And so the question is can we put people into permanent housing? And if so, where?
Do we have do we have enough mental health support, which is a big buzzword that's thrown out there.
Yeah.
What do we do and how do we do that? Because you can't force people into seeking help.
Well, that's right. I mean, if you went back to the 1950s, you wouldn't see homelessness as much in the United States. And the reason for that is that the homeless were institutionalized.
Yep.
Right? So we had all of these institutions, mental institutions, and I forget there was a sort of specific term for them. But the deinstitutionalization of the homeless in the late 60s was sort of part of the civil rights movement. It was this idea that they also have civil rights, and that is, unless they're a threat to themselves or others, they have every right to be outside and homeless. And so, it's really about the visibility of the problem, and then, and I think Newsom even was talking about trying to put people, to lower the threshold for putting people into treatment centers.
And I believe the program was called Care Courts.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think LA was one of the cities that was chosen to have a kind of a pilot version of that. I don't know the current status of it, but I'd be interested to see the success of that.
Yeah, and I'm not on the details of that either, but those are the kinds of things that can kind of move the ball forward sort of incrementally.
Yeah.
And that's really, with a problem as difficult as homeless policy or even affordable housing, that's really, what you can hope for is kind of incremental progress.
I think I'm gathering from all this is a very multi-pronged issue that seems a lot of layers that's not going to be solved anytime soon, but there's creative attempts.
Universal basic income.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there was another study that came out recently, and it showed that when people it was another pilot study, were given, this sort of basic...
Yeah, like $100 a month.
No, I think it was a little bit more than that. I think it was a little closer to 1,000.
Okay, that would have been it, yeah.
But, their lives just got better.
Mm-hmm.
And they were less likely to fall into homelessness. They had better food for their kids. And, I don't know how you scale that up. In a society as large as the United States and as diverse as the United States, that would be tricky to do. But I think something like that is worthwhile.
Yeah. Where do you think homelessness is in a place like Los Angeles, let's say, in the next 10 years? So it's a little out there,
my goodness, yeah. No, that's an interesting question. So it really gets back to that bigger supply and demand issue. Is Los Angeles going to be able to make some dents in that. So the initial studies of the accessory dwelling units,
ADUs.
or the ADUs, suggested that not many were being constructed. And the Turner Center at UC Berkeley put out one of these policy reports, and I assigned it to my class, and it was not very promising. It looked like, well, we had big hopes for accessory dwelling units. And then recently, another study, I think, came out of UCLA that began to suggest we're starting to make some progress. So the answer in Los Angeles is you have to densify, right? Los Angeles is not going to move, anywhere. And so you have to densify neighborhoods. And, I do see that in my own neighborhood. And, if you can build 4 units on one lot, or 3 additional units, you can make a lot of progress. But, those units are like, I don't know, $400,000 or $500,000.
Yeah. They seem like the price of what the old starter home used to be.
That's right. That's a good way of putting it. And so, how many are going to be? It's going to be a really long term. So, I don't think this is a problem that you would look necessarily at 10 years down the road, but something like 30 years down the road.
But we're starting to see some of the seeds of change possible.
I think so.
Yeah.
And then I think for this big, so part of this is demographic driven, like the baby boomers. There was a lot of them. There were fewer of us, Generation Xers, by the way. When I got into the housing market, I had multiple possibilities. There were multiple houses that I was interested in, and a lot of them had this was like around 2003. There were no offers on these killer houses up in Montecito Heights with an incredible view, going for $300,000.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, but then like the millennials started to get into the housing market, and then behind them will be this other big generation.
They're both fighting over, seems like, the small piece that's out there.
Yeah, the older millennials have probably managed to get into a condo, or certainly many of them better than that. But I really sense a certain kind of frustration and almost resignation on the part of Generation Z, that they kind of think, well, I'll probably never own a house, and that's not really what you want in a country where land ownership, particularly home ownership, is such a big part of our culture. Right, the American dream.
Correct.
And so, this is really a problem not just for local governments or state governments, but I think over the next decades, the national government has to get involved in some capacity, both on the affordable housing supply and demand issue, but also on the homelessness issue, because local governments have to provide core services, right, and that's streets and take garbage, providing electricity or whatever the core services are in that city, but they cannot afford to tackle housing affordability. They can provide incentives, density bonuses, or things like that, but so the national government is going to have to come up with some kind of a Marshall Plan. I mean, goodness, if we can spend all this money on national defense, could some of whatever invading countries, could some of that be redirected toward a national housing policy? And I think ultimately that's where kind of the big kind of noticeable changes will take place.
I'm sure that's going to be a talking point this fall in the election about home ownership. I mean, I'm sure those are the kitchen issue tables that many people like myself that are my age group are caring about how do I get myself into a home and ownership. So
and that would be, I don't think the discussion would be that different, on the Republican side of it. It's not really a partisan issue that I mean, maybe you could say deregulation or whatever that would produce more housing. But I don't actually think you're going to hear a lot of discussion about housing affordability in the election. I think there's enough craziness out there that we're going to be talking about.
Exactly.
They seem to prefer to talk about crazy things rather than actual issues that affect people's lives. So
and it all trickles down, like we said, all the way down to homelessness and where we are today. So it's a lot of nuances to this issue, but. Thank you for joining us here today.
Anytime, Javier. Great pleasure.
Of course. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Javier Rojas, and this is Diving into the Discourse.
Thank you for joining us for Diving into the Discourse. You can watch and listen to more of our podcasts on the CSUN Conversations website and become part of the CSUN Conversations community.